Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy again from your WCA Biology B class, and we are looking again still at Unit 4. Now we are in Lesson 13. We're almost towards the end of this unit. There's just a few more lessons left. As I said previously, this is kind of a long unit, but I hope you are finding the unit to be fairly interesting, and like I said before, kind of building on concepts that are familiar to you, so maybe just a little bit easier as well. All right, so our keywords here are biodiversity, community, ecosystem, invasive species, introduced species, population, and species richness. All right, let's go ahead and explore what is going on in Lesson 13. So it's really kind of reiterating on some of the concepts that we've already talked about, even in the previous lesson as well, talking about how ecosystems are affected by incidences that can happen within the ecosystem, and that can actually reduce the biodiversity. Remember, the biodiversity is the variation among organisms in an ecosystem. So if some sort of event occurs, some sort of disruption or disturbance within that ecosystem, that can affect the different variety of organisms that occupy that ecosystem. A fairly extreme example of that is what happened in Deepwater Horizon with the Deepwater Horizon drilling platform back in 2010. You can research this. You can get a lot more information on it. There's some videos. There was a whole movie with Mark Wahlberg on Deepwater Horizon. So there's a whole bunch of information you can get on what happened and what caused this catastrophe. But the bottom line is there was a deep water drilling platform drilling for oil, and there was a problem with it that caused it to explode, and just millions of gallons of oil actually leaked into the Gulf of Mexico. I'm not sure if it says how many million in this particular blurb here. It just says millions of gallons specifically. And this actually leaked over several months. They tried plugging it. It wasn't really able to get the leak to stop. And so it just kept leaking and gushing oil for many, many months, which caused a lot of devastation to wildlife and ecosystems all along the Gulf Shore. Not only did it cover beaches and stuff like that, it sank to the bottom of the ocean, so it kind of affected all levels of the food chain, from the phytoplankton that formed the base to the top predators. It even impacted thousands of seabirds because their feathers were covered with oil. So even today, which it's been over 10 years since the Deepwater Horizon accident, we're still seeing impacts of what happened 10 years previous. Then it goes into another example, kind of a more simplistic example. Say there's a storm in the rainforest that knocks down a single tree. Well, the rainforest, as you know, has a fairly thick canopy of trees that causes the forest floor to be fairly shaded. If a tree falls down because of a storm, it can cause an additional patch of sunlight that forms, and it can change the biodiversity in that particular area. It's a fairly limited change. It's usually very temporary when changes are small like this. But if the change was bigger, say there was a disease that was killing a whole species of trees, then the biodiversity would be greater affected. Um, it says scientists often look to see like how rich the species are by collecting data on the species richness in a community. That's the number of species in a specific community. That was one of your vocab terms. And then it starts talking about something called introduced species. Now, we have talked about invasive species in the past. Introduced species is sometimes used interchangeably with invasive species, but they're not exactly the same thing. So any non-native species, which is another term that we use, non-natives or introduced species, are species that are not native to that area. They come from someplace else. They don't always cause issues, however. Just because they're introduced or they're non-native doesn't necessarily mean that they're have any kind of negative impact at all, right? Some of them do. They talk a little bit about red imported fire ants here and zebra mussels. They were introduced unintentionally to the United States and have devastating impacts. As we know, as we've talked about zebra mussels before, they can have impacts on essentially They can clog like intake pipes and stuff when you're getting your water from lakes, and they can clog up the machinery inside of ships and things like that. They can actually cause corrosion to pipes and things as well because they secrete enzymes. So they're kind of a pain and they can cause a lot of damage. They also talk a little bit about these red imported fire ants that can cause damage to new homes because they destroy the wood. And they are having issues with those kind of in the south. Those aren't an issue that we have up here in the northern climates. So only a small percentage of the introduced species ever become what we call invasives. Invasives are species that outcompete natives. They displace the natives and they reduce the overall biodiversity in a specific area, right? Because they take away native species, which alters the whole food web. So again, remembering that not all introduced species are invasives, but it's a gamble, really. When you're introducing new species, you don't know which are going to become invasive and which aren't. So it's very important to preserve native species in ecosystems to avoid catastrophes like the fire ants, the zebra mussels, emerald ash borer. Talk here about lionfish as well, and that kind of stuff. The other thing that's mentioned, which we actually talked about in our previous lesson, is how climate change plays a role in invasive species. When climate changes, that sometimes makes a new biological niche that introduced species have a better shot of fitting into. Um, for example, if the temperature of the water increases and non-native species don't necessarily adapt to that change as well as an introduced species, that could make way for kind of a takeover by that introduced species and have it become invasive. Let's see here. Okay, so it says climate change is also helping with the spread of the lionfish. It was kind of limited to the tropics. It is a voracious eater. It eats pretty much anything. It's kind of a garbage fish in that way, or just will eat anything like a raccoon, essentially. Trash bandit or trash can fish. And they breed very, very well also. So those are kind of two things that make a species more likely to be invasive is that they're really not picky when it comes to eating. They have very good reproductive strategies, and oftentimes they don't have predators. And so those are kind of the three main things we see with invasive species, right? And as the climate is continuing to warm, these lionfish are no longer limited to their tropical waters. They can move to areas further north, which then allows them to spread and reduces biodiversity in some of the northern climates as well. All right, so again, checking in and practice. You get a little video to watch and some more questions to practice through here. And then it talks a little bit more about just another examples of invasive species, talking about the Burmese pythons and how they are invasive species and that kind of stuff. So pretty much that is the gist of this lesson, guys. Read through it, read a little bit more about the Burmese python. I won't be going through that in my live broadcast here, but if you have any questions, you know to let me know. Reach out to me, ask me in class, send me a webmail, give me a phone call, something like that. Otherwise, guys, I will see you in our next lesson, and I hope you have a great day.